Hi everybody, welcome to APUSH Unit 7 from 1890 to 1945. This is 10 to 17% of the AP exam and there's a lot of information. This is essentially America becoming a global power, America coming onto the world stage with imperialism, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II. So let's dive into it. You want to keep in mind the guiding question for this unit. In what ways did America grow into its role as a world power, and what factors shaped and hindered that growth? This first slide explains the similarities and differences in attitudes about the nation's proper role in the world. This gets into pro-imperialist arguments and anti-imperialist arguments. Make sure that you kind of know the main thoughts on each side. What is the argument for imperialism? What are the arguments against it? Next, explain the causes and effects of the Spanish-American War. The College Board does not really care a lot about the wars themselves. They really do want you to be able to focus on events that lead to war and events that are results from war. So causes and effects. Think about territorial acquisitions that America gained as a result of the Spanish-American War. This is where America gets its empire: Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines for $20 million. What does it mean that America was involved in suppressing the nationalist movement in the Philippines? What does that mean for America's role going forward? Next, you want to look at progressivism. What are the goals and effects of the progressive reform movement? Progressivism is the second of the big major reform periods in American history. So what is it that they're trying to fix? They're looking to correct the problems that were kind of unearthed or uncovered during the Gilded Age. You want to know about muckrakers. What are muckrakers? Who are muckrakers? What was their goal? The idea of the three progressive presidents. What is the role of government during the progressive era? What about national legislation? Make sure you know those four progressive amendments, the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th amendments. All right, make sure you can compare attitudes towards the use of natural resources. What are the differences between preservationists and conservationists towards protecting the environment or using the environment? What was Teddy Roosevelt's role in that, and why? Why was he so passionate about protecting the environment? What about the creation of national parks? What is it about that he was able to use the power of his presidency to focus on national parks? Then let's look at American involvement in World War I, the first really big global conflict that America's involved in. Why did America try to stay neutral for so long? America doesn't get involved in World War I until 1917, 3 years into the war. So what was it that was keeping America's interest away from Europe? But also, what was it that finally pushed America over the edge? What could Wilson no longer tolerate with what was going on in the European war, that he had to go before Congress and ask for a declaration of war to make the world safe for democracy? That was his goal. He also had his 14 points. Make sure you know what those 14 points are referencing, specifically about the League of Nations. When the war was over, there were a lot of Americans who did not want to stay involved in Europe. They wanted to get America back to isolationism. Wilson didn't believe that was going to be the way forward. Wilson was passionate about America signing the Treaty of Versailles, joining the League of Nations. What was it that the senators back home were afraid of? What did they basically put the brakes on in terms of America joining the League of Nations? And why were they so against America kind of joining this global agency? Then let's look at the 1920s. We've got reactions to international immigrants still coming into the country, both before and after World War I. There's also another rise of nativism. During the 1920s, we really see an uptick in nativist philosophies, and a lot of that is a reaction to some of these international immigrants coming into the country. How did internal migration within the country, how did that shift as a result of war production jobs in the North? The Great Migration, for the first time, allowed economic opportunities for Blacks in the South to be able to move out of those sharecropping worlds and move into centers of industry. So how is that going to impact demographics? How is that going to impact culture, society? Look at the causes and effects of innovations in communication and technology. Specifically in the 1920s, we see the impact of the Model T Ford, this affordable vehicle that pretty much most working families could afford. What kind of independence does that mean for Americans? Make sure you know about the impact of the radio. For the first time, all Americans from east to west, north to south are listening to the same type of music, jazz. What does that mean to truly have a national culture for the first time with music, with this new Hollywood world? What does it mean for America to have a cinema industry? And again, to kind of promote this idea of a national culture. Look again at the effects of those migration shifts in terms of opportunities for groups that really hadn't had opportunities before. We talked about the Great Migration a minute ago. This is a new economic opportunity for African Americans that they've never been allowed to have in America before. You have a large demographic shift in America of Black Americans moving out of the South into places like New York City, settling in Harlem, places like Chicago, places like Detroit. It's going to cause a political shift in demographics and elections, but also a cultural shift. You've got the growth of the Harlem Renaissance in there. For the first time, Black Americans are able to feel proud and express being proud of being Black because their culture is celebrated with jazz, with literature, with dance. Think about the controversies over gender roles. The 1920s is the world of the flapper. And you've got women who now have the political right to vote for the first time. How does that change their social life? How does that change the ideas about the roles of women? Make sure when you're talking about the 20s, make sure you understand it. It is a decade of contrast. It's traditional versus modern. It's rural versus urban. It's just these worlds where Americans felt that they had to choose one side or the other. And that leads to conflict over science, over religion, over issues related to race and immigration. We see a spike up of KKK membership during the 1920s because you've got this rise in nativism, and the Ku Klux Klan was not just going to target Blacks in the South. The Ku Klux Klan was going to target anybody who was not white, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon. So Catholics, Jews, minorities were all targeted. Then we move into the Great Depression. This is a lot of information and a lot of detail with all of the New Deal agencies, but big picture wise, make sure you understand the causes of the Great Depression and its effects on the economy. It's not just the stock market crashed and the whole world kind of collapsed. There's a lead up. There's a big lead up of events. What were the economic problems coming out of World War I, moving into the Great Depression, that for the European countries, for some of the Asian countries, they were never really resolved after World War I. And when the American stock market crashed, there wasn't really anybody for other countries to turn to for help. How did the Great Depression kind of solidify that transition of the American economy from agricultural to industrial? Because we see a lot of farmers, they were struggling through the 1920s. And then when America went through its own Great Depression, it was like, we're done, we're out. What does the Great Depression mean in terms of the role of government? We see calls for stronger governmental regulation over the economy. And how did policymakers respond to the mass unemployment, the social upheavals? How does that reflect on American ideas of liberalism and how much role the government should have in Americans' day-to-day life? Then looking at FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and his New Deal programs. How did those New Deal programs impact not just the economic situation of the time, but the social of the time, the political stuff of the time? Make sure you know kind of the details of FDR's New Deal relief, recovery, and reform programs. What were they designed to fix? What were they designed just to sort of put a Band-Aid on? And then which programs were designed to make sure that something like the Great Depression never happened again? What is the legacy of the New Deal? Which of those programs are still around today? We still have Social Security. We still have our bank deposits insured by the federal government. Those are all New Deal programs. There are buildings and post offices and schools and roads and bridges and dams all across the country that are a result of New Deal programs. So think about the legacy that is still ongoing in America today. Then let's look at the buildup into World War II. I said earlier that World War II is a direct result of the way World War I ended. So the United States reverted back to isolationism after World War I. They did not sign the Treaty of Versailles. They signed a separate peace treaty with Germany, I think in 1922, so years later. The U.S. never joined the League of Nations. And why did Americans stay out of World War II? World War II began on September 1st, 1939. Americans didn't join until the attack on Pearl Harbor a little over 2 years later, December 7th, 1941. So why did Americans keep trying to stay out of World War II again? And then once the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, how does the U.S. immediately shift into war mode? Think about the mass mobilization in terms of even before America was in the war, America was supplying the war. So that's going to help end the Depression. It's also going to create an allied response kind of before America is officially in. And then once America is officially in the war, as of December 7th, 1941, what does that mean when the soldiers all go off to fight? Who's running the factories? What does that mean in terms of economic opportunities for women at home, for minorities at home? And then back to the idea of civil liberties. How did the American government protect or take away civil liberties during World War II? Specifically, make sure you know about Japanese Americans and being sent into these internment camps as a violation of their civil liberties, but under the guise that this is a wartime strategy that we're trying to protect. What about immigrants coming in from Mexico who were working as migrant workers, who were supplying kind of the farm situations at home while American soldiers were fighting overseas? What is that going to lead to when we talk about immigration in the future? And then just the World War II in and of itself. What are the causes and effects of the victory of the U.S. and its allies over the Axis powers? What was America's goal in World War II? They viewed the war as a fight for the survival of freedom and democracy. This was a good versus bad war. Think about the Japanese wartime atrocities. Think about the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews and the other marginalized citizens of Europe. What does that mean kind of going forward? What is America's role towards humanity? Not just other Americans, but kind of moving out of the war. What is it going to look like in terms of how should America respond to some of these atrocities? And then just a little of strategic stuff. Make sure you know what island hopping is in the Pacific, the Allied strategy of advancing closer and closer to Japan. Make sure you know what the D-Day invasion is, that continental landing by the Allied troops that's going to lead to the defeat of Germany and Europe. And then closing it out, World War II ends with America entering the nuclear age and dropping atomic bombs. For the first and only time in history, nuclear weapons have been used against an enemy during a time of war. And that really leads into this next unit. But what are the consequences of U.S. involvement in World War II? Know about the big post-war peace settlements. Know about the Yalta Conference. That's going to lay the foundation for the next unit. Know about the various settlements in terms of the Potsdam Conference. What does that mean in terms of closing out kind of the peace of World War II? And then the U.S. ends the World War II period by entering into the atomic age. The U.S. emerges from World War II as the most powerful nation on the planet. For a window of about 4 or 5 years, America is the only country in the world that has the money, that has the infrastructure, and that has the atomic bomb. And what does that mean kind of setting up in the next unit America's role is going to be? There's a lot. There's a lot in this unit. I get it if you feel overwhelmed. Take it a little bit at a time. You're going to get there. All right. See you soon.